Hi, my name is Claire, and as a spiritual advancement coach, I love to help people enhance their spiritual connection. When you're connecting with your guides, when you're connecting with your higher self, when you connect into the truth of who you were beyond past lives and into the multidimensional, it really makes this particular lifetime so much easier to understand what your purpose is, why you've got the passions that you have, and to really manifest that life you really enjoy to live. Recently, I was talking to a client and she was like, Claire, when are you going to put together the video on Atlantis? It seems like so many clients at the moment are traveling back to Atlantis. There seems to be a lot of soul contracts and things that were playing back at that time that are repeating now. If you're unfamiliar with Atlantis, Atlantis was here on Earth. It was here at a time, where the history books will tell us, there was a big volcano or there was a big flood. And while that's probably true, Atlantis happened, before the history books were really written. Knowing how time is a bit of an illusion, knowing how time, is only measured by our human brains, it's actually quite fascinating to travel outside of time, to go back to these beautiful places and to discover what was your role in Atlantis. Now, personally, I've taken so many clients back to this time, and there's this continuing thread that I've noticed playing out in most of those clients' lives. That's about being really beautiful, connected healers. The beautiful clients that I work with who are tapped into their healing abilities tend to have past lives in Atlantis. The energy there was amazing. And of course, it's got its own history of what made it amazing and then what made it destruct, what made it crumble. So let me start to talk to you about my experience of what I've witnessed from clients. I've noticed that Atlantis is a time where when Mother Earth put her call out to say, yes, I want to be a planet. Yes, I want the souls to come here and to live and co-create and come as one. A lot of the souls from the multiverse, the beings, all came here to Earth. Now, they came from worlds that were like grand healers. They came from worlds that were digitally minded. They came from worlds that were everything in between, grand teachers, masters, so on and so forth. So Earth was here. When these beings came in, there was an initial setup where these grand healers, these priests, priestesses, were considered royalty. They were in charge and they were born into this world with specific spiritual gifts. It meant that they were in charge. However, as the spiritual teachings, from those from those classrooms, from those elders teaching other people about how to enhance their spiritual gifts, when those people that weren't of this kind of royal blood, the high priestess and high priests, when those people started to accelerate their spiritual gifts, the power started to become a bit unstable. It meant that when those people, the average people, really heightened their spiritual gifts, it kind of gave them the upper hand. And so there was this sort of to and fro, the old and the new, do we use these gifts? Don't we use these gifts? And the other thing to keep in mind is that some of these priests and priestesses had taught people who were still in their ego state. They still came from other worlds where power was incredibly important to them. And they really pushed the boundaries with what they could do with technology. When you think about the pictures we've seen of the man and the horse body, when we think about, the manipulation of DNA, the manipulation of quantum matter, this is the stuff that those power-hungry beings were creating in the labs. They had coerced people to come into these labs to play with what they called like the light in the petri dish. Now, the scientists, the beings who were there to do the work, thought they were doing good work, enhancing the light, bringing in the spiritual gifts. But what they were actually doing was being deceived. And so when they were starting to manipulate the the DNA, the matter, so on and so forth, it got to a point where they were getting really, really close to creating like a black hole. They were getting really, really close to just completely destructing Mother Earth. And so the powers that be, the higher councils, the galactic councils, somehow took Earth off its timeline. And with that, just taking Earth off her timeline, just taking her out of our 3D time, meant that the beings there that were already on Atlantis, you know, felt the destruction, like their whole world kind of collapsed in on them. That's when we take people back to these Atlantean past lives, and they feel the guilt of you know, the survivor's guilt, or the regret of what actually happened. That it wasn't actually like a volcano, it wasn't a big flood, but what it was Earth being taken out of her timeline, taken to a place where she could rest and recover. And it meant that, you know, we got called a timeout. Now, there were 3 of these falls of Atlantis. Some people say there was just one, but there was actually 3 times, you know, the Galactic Council pulled her off her timeline. Stop, need to rest and recover. So the beings that were actually on Atlantis at that time, you know, think about Mother Earth, think about, you know, being here in Australia or being in Hawaii, those beings who kind of sensed that this was coming, because they were highly spiritual, they were highly psychic. Some of them actually went underground. Some of them became hollow earthers. They became beings where what we would now call timeline refugees, which means that the beings that are here now in this current time still feel like there's a part of them that's missing. They still feel like there's a part of them that's lost. And so a lot of the work that I do is helping them recover that aspect of themselves so that they can be one now, they can be whole, they can release that feeling of being lost. But I've gone off on a tangent there. So if we go back to, you know, getting that picture of beings going into caves, you know, getting that respite, getting that time off, you know, sorry, that time off, going into those caves and really for their survival. I've had clients there that have found themselves kind of walk into water, and now they must have died. They must have had a level of transition, because the next thing they know is they're waking up and walking out of the water in a completely different body. It's like they've traveled to a water world where, again, their soul got to rest and recover. So I've also worked with people who knew that this collapse was coming, and they carry so much guilt. A lot of these people have been, some of those priests and priestesses, they knew that this was coming, and they took on the blame for not being stronger, for not doing more, for not showing up more. And that blame still carries through to this current time. So let me talk to you about this current time, because, you know, we've experienced things like COVID, we've experienced things like IVF, we've experienced the authorities pushing pretty hard for us to be back in that lab, for us to be manipulating the DNA, for us to be pushing the limits of what's possible in the human body. Now, I have been an egg donor. I'm not saying that that's of that dark energy I was talking before. I'm talking about the manipulation of DNA that is not ethical. Lack of consideration for what the life that they're birthing is like. If you could just imagine that ego sort of like pushing at the expense of the being that's being birthed into life. So there was a lot of that going on in Atlantis, and a lot of those beings that experienced that lesson are here now. And they're here now really pushing the limits. They're here now saying, wait a minute, the authority, the powers that be needs to stop. They're here now in this kind of energy, clearing away any of that survival guilt, any of that being suppressed within their spiritual gifts. All of that's now coming to the surface. So if you're feeling like, you know, maybe like you want to battle the authorities, or if you're feeling like you're on that spiritual path and you can't do enough, or if you're feeling like you really kind of don't belong here on Earth, there's a part of you missing, the chances are a lot of your soul is still, a lot of your soul story has been in Atlantis. So the next thing that I want to talk about is Atlantis's connection to Lemuria. Now, I love the energy of Lemuria. I know that I played a big role in Lemuria, and when I was in Lemuria, I would have been in Hawaii. I know that when my partner and I went to Hawaii, and I just felt at home, like I just felt sparkly and like I just knew this place. I had said to my partner, you know, if we drive around that road, there's going to be like this cove, there's going to be this inlet, there's going to be such and such, you know, this is where they brought in the ships to help us, you know. I was just so excited. And when we did actually go around that bend, when we did go into that cove, I felt like I was at home. I was just like, he's saying to me, how did you know this was here? And I was like, no, I've been here. I can connect into the land. I can connect into the rocks and the water. I know it's history. And, you know, lucky him, he got me just waffling on about the stories and what we did with the crystals and the caves and the ceremony and the tribes. Whew. So I've, again, taking you on a completely different path with Lemuria. Let me connect it back into Atlantis. So when Atlantis was taken off its timeline, there were pockets of time when when Earth got put back on the timeline, but it got put back on as with a different kind of generation, with the ancient future selves of those beings being Lemurian. And so there's this shuffle in the timeline where it goes Atlantis, Lemuria, Atlantis, Lemuria, Atlantis, Lemuria. And so both of them share very, very similar stories. One was a lot more about the technology. One was a lot more about the crystals and putting in the ley lines and, yeah, coming together, versus the other one, which was a lot more power driven. So is that I'm just checking in with my guides and my team. You know, there was a lot of information shared there. Is there anything else that we need to share? They're just talking to you about if you're getting that feeling, that tingle, that how this is starting to resonate, you know, within your meditations, within your healings, to maybe go back and explore what your role was there in Atlantis. Were you an elder? Were you a teacher? Were you a priestess? Were you a scientist? You know, what were you doing there? And, you know, getting your guides and your team to ask to bring in the bring in the downloads and the energy from then to help you remember who you were. Because I can pretty much bet that what you were doing there in Atlantis will be playing out somehow in the now. It's quite fabulous to know that, because once you actually go and once you know what you were doing, if you were a teacher back then and you're like in a teaching role now, it just says, yeah, okay, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. How can I make this better? How can I start teaching, you know, students more about their spiritual connection, the things that I missed out on teaching them back then? Oh, it's so exciting. So that's a little bit of my sharing in Atlantis, and I'll be pleased to share more with you. Bye.